Picture yourself standing on the deck of a Royal Navy warship in the autumn of 1722, somewhere in the gray water off the coast of West Africa. You are barefoot, because the planks are cooler than your boots in this heat, and your name is Thomas Hale, and 8 months ago you were a rope maker in Bristol with a wife and a baby, and absolutely no intention of ever going to sea. You did not choose this. For men with cudgels chose it for you, on a dark street, 3 doors from your own home. That is how you came to be here, leaning on the rail of a ship whose name you still sometimes forget, watching a sail come up over the horizon. It is a strange sail. It is not flying the colors of any nation. As it climbs out of the haze, you can see it is a sloop, low and fast, and it is closing on you with the kind of confidence that only comes from a ship that hunts other ships for a living. The man beside you swears under his breath and crosses himself. The boatswain is shouting. Somewhere below, a drum begins to beat the crew to quarters. And in the middle of all this noise and motion, you, Thomas Hale, find that you are doing something very calm and very quiet. You are doing arithmetic. You are weighing two futures. In one, you fight off these pirates, and you go on serving a navy that has not paid you in 14 months, on a ship where a man was flogged senseless last week for answering an officer too slowly, eating bread so full of weevils you tap it on the table to knock them out before you swallow. In the other future, the pirates win. And here is the thing that would horrify the officers screaming at you to load your musket, the thing you would never say aloud. In the second future, you are not entirely sure you lose. This is the strangest fact about the golden age of piracy, and it is almost completely absent from every film and every storybook you have ever seen. Thousands of ordinary sailors, men exactly like the one you are imagining yourself to be, did not fear capture by pirates. Some of them welcomed it. Some surrendered without firing a shot. Some, when the fighting was over, lined up to volunteer. And a startling number, when their own navy or their own merchant captain came to rescue them, refused to be rescued at all. Everything you think you know about who the prisoner was in these encounters, and who the free man was, is backwards. And to understand why, you have to forget the cartoon and look at the contracts. The picture in your head is simple because it has been simple your whole life. On one side, the Royal Navy. Brave men in clean uniforms, the wooden wall of the nation, heroes who kept the sea lanes safe and brought villains to justice. On the other side, pirates. Drunken, murderous, lawless monsters who robbed and killed for the pleasure of it and who were quite rightly hunted down and hanged. Good versus evil. Order versus chaos. The cartoon is so familiar that you have probably never once stopped to question it. But here is the claim this story is going to make, and it is not a small one. For a great many of the men who actually lived through this period, that picture was upside down. The lawless side was, in some very real and measurable ways, the freer and the fairer side. The lawful side was the one you ran from, and the choice to be taken by pirates, far from being the nightmare we imagine, was for some men the single most rational decision of their working lives. That sounds like a provocation. It sounds like the kind of thing said to get your attention. So over the next while, this story is going to earn it by answering 3 questions properly. First, why on earth would any sane man choose outlaws over his own navy? Second, what exactly was the Navy doing to its sailors that made desertion to a pirate ship look like a step up in the world? And third, what were the pirates actually offering, written down in black and white, that the most powerful navy on the planet could not or would not match? Because the answer to that last question is the one that has been quietly buried for 300 years, and it is the most surprising part of all. To understand any of this, you have to understand the world that produced it, and that world begins with a war ending. In 1713, the long war of the Spanish Succession came to a close, and across the British Empire something happened that no one had quite planned for. The Royal Navy, which at the height of the fighting had needed tens of thousands of sailors to crew its ships, suddenly did not need them anymore. Peace had broken out, and peace, for a sailor, was a catastrophe. Ships were laid up. Crews were paid off when they were paid at all, and turned loose onto the docks of Bristol and Portsmouth and London by the thousand. These were men who knew nothing but the sea, who had spent years learning to reef a sail in a gale and fire a cannon in a rolling swell, and who now found there was no honest work for any of them. So you had a glut of skilled, desperate, unemployed seamen, and you had merchant ships still moving cargo along the great triangle of the Atlantic trade. Sugar from the Caribbean, tobacco from the American colonies, enslaved human beings carried in chains from the coast of Africa, manufactured goods from London. Enormous wealth, moving slowly across open water, lightly guarded. On one side, men with the exact skills required to take that wealth. On the other, wealth almost begging to be taken. Piracy was not a moral failing that descended on these waters. It was an economic event waiting to happen, and it happened on a massive scale. Now here comes the first twist, and it is the one that unravels the whole cartoon. We imagine pirates as a separate species, a dark tribe of born criminals who appeared from nowhere to terrorize honest sailors. But that is not who they were. The overwhelming majority of pirates in this period were former Royal Navy men and former merchant sailors. They were not strangers to the ships they attacked. They had served on ships exactly like them. They had eaten the same rotten food, slept in the same cramped, stinking quarters, felt the same lash across their own backs. When a pirate sloop ran down a merchant vessel and the boarding party came over the rail, the men they were robbing were very often men they recognized, men they had sailed with, men who, in some cases, they were about to invite to come along. The pirates were not the opposite of the merchant crews. They were what the merchant crews became when they finally decided they had taken enough. To understand the choice that Thomas Hale is weighing at that rail, you do not need to understand criminals. You need to read the contract. So let us read it. Lay two documents side by side on a table. On the left, the rules a man lived under in the Royal Navy and on most merchant ships. On the right, the rules a man lived under once he signed aboard a pirate vessel. Both of them, by a small and bitter coincidence of language, were called articles. The navies were the articles of war. They were read aloud to the crew, and they were essentially a long list of the ways in which you could be punished, a great many of which ended in death. They placed absolute power in the hands of the captain. He was, on his own ship, very nearly a god. He decided who was punished and how. He decided how hard the men worked and on how little sleep. He could order a flogging on his own authority for almost any offense he chose to name, and there was no one aboard he answered to, and no one a sailor could appeal to. The food was whatever the contractors had supplied, which meant biscuit riddled with weevils, salt meat that had sometimes been in the barrel for years, and water that turned green and foul in the casks. The pay was low, and worse than low, it was unreliable, often held back for months or years, sometimes paid in tickets that a sailor could only cash at a discount if he could cash them at all. And you could not simply leave. Desertion was a hanging offense. The contract on the left was, in plain terms, a contract you could be forced into by violence, could not legally escape, and which gave you almost nothing in return except the constant threat of the lash. Now read the contract on the right. A pirate ship's articles were a different kind of document entirely because of one extraordinary fact. They were written by the crew and agreed to by the crew, and every man signed them. On Bartholomew Roberts' ship, and on dozens of others whose articles survive, the crew voted. They voted on where the ship would sail. They voted on whether to attack a given target. On many ships they elected their own captain, and just as importantly, they could remove him. A pirate captain held absolute authority only in one narrow circumstance, during a chase or a battle, when someone had to give orders instantly and be obeyed. The rest of the time he was simply one man among equals, and if the crew decided he was a coward or a fool or too cruel or too soft, they could vote him out and put another man in his place. There are real cases of exactly this happening. The contract on the right was a contract you chose, that you helped write, and that you could change. This is the core of it, and it is why the whole familiar picture turns inside out. What happened on the deck of a captured ship was, very often, not a kidnapping at all. It was a defection. A man stepped from a world where he was property, owned and used and disposable, into a world where he was, for the first time in his life, a citizen with a vote and a share. He did not lose his freedom when the pirates took the ship. In the only sense that mattered to him, he gained it. Read the contract, and the prisoner and the free man swap places in front of your eyes. And if that were the whole of it, the choice would already make a kind of sense. But it is not the whole of it, because we have not yet looked properly at just how bad the contract on the left really was. We have not yet looked at what the Navy actually did to the men it owned. And it gets worse. It gets much worse. Start with how they got you in the first place. The Royal Navy could never recruit enough volunteers to crew its ships, for the very good reason that the conditions were so well known that few men volunteered twice. So the Navy took men by force, through an institution called the press gang. A press gang was a party of armed sailors, led by an officer, who roamed the streets and taverns of port towns looking for men to seize. In theory, they were supposed to take only experienced seamen. In practice, they took whoever they could overpower. They took men coming home from their own weddings. They took apprentices, fishermen, dock workers, the occasional unlucky farmer who had wandered into town on market day. They beat men who resisted. They dragged them, bleeding, down to the boats and out to the waiting ships, and by the time a man's family learned what had happened to him, he was already at sea and beyond reach. This is how Thomas Hale, our rope maker from Bristol, came to be standing at that rail. He was not a sailor who signed up for adventure. He was a civilian who was hunted down in his own street and stolen. The Navy began many a man's service with an act that, performed by anyone else, would have been called kidnapping. Then there was the discipline. The lash was not an occasional horror reserved for the worst offenses. It was the everyday machinery of order used freely and often. A man could be flogged for insolence, for slowness, for drunkenness, for theft, for the captain simply deciding to make an example of someone. The instrument was the cat of 9 tails, a whip with 9 knotted cords, and a sentence was counted in dozens of lashes. A dozen could open a man's back. Several dozen could turn it to raw meat. And for the worst cases, there was a punishment of almost unimaginable cruelty called flogging round the fleet, in which the condemned man was rowed from ship to ship in the harbor and given a portion of his total sentence alongside each one, so that hundreds of strokes were spread across an afternoon, the wounds reopened again and again, the man often dying somewhere along the row of waiting hulls. The crews of every ship were made to watch. The point, as it so often was not only to punish the one man. It was to terrify all the others, to remind every sailor at the rail what the contract he had been forced to sign actually meant. Then there was the food and the slow death that came with it. On a long voyage, the fresh provisions ran out within weeks, and the men were left to live on salt meat and hard biscuit, with no fruit, no vegetables, nothing green. We now know that this diet, lacking vitamin C, produced scurvy, a disease that killed sailors in numbers that dwarfed every battle of the age. Scurvy made a man's gums rot and bleed. It made old wounds, long healed, split open again as if freshly cut. It made his teeth fall out and his joints swell, and his strength drain away until he could not stand. Tens of thousands of sailors died this way, slowly, in agony, in the dark below decks, on ships of the most advanced navy on earth, because the contract that owned them did not value their lives enough to feed them properly. And then the final insult. There was the matter of what happened to you when the work broke your body. Sailing was brutally dangerous. Men fell from the rigging. Men were crushed by shifting cargo. Men lost hands to snapping ropes and legs to cannon fire and eyes to splinters of flying wood. And when that happened in the Royal Navy or aboard a merchant ship, the answer, overwhelmingly, was nothing. There was no compensation. There was no pension worth the name for the ordinary seaman. A man who gave an arm to the service was, more often than not, simply put ashore, broken and useless and penniless, to beg on the docks where he had once worked. The contract on the left took your freedom, took your back, took your health, and when you had nothing left to give, it took your livelihood and left you to starve. Read it all together, line after line, and the question stops being why would a sailor run to the pirates? The question becomes how did any of them stay? Which brings us at last to the real answer, to the thing the pirates were offering that has been so carefully forgotten. Because for all their violence, and they were violent, and for all the genuine cruelty some of them committed, the pirate ships of this era ran on a set of arrangements that, when you actually read them, look less like the rules of a criminal gang and more like a charter of rights drawn up a full century before the world was ready to take such ideas seriously. Take the matter of pay, the thing that the Navy handled so miserably. A pirate crew did not work for wages. They worked for shares. When a prize was taken, the value was divided according to a formula that everyone had agreed to in advance, and that was written into the articles. An ordinary crewman got one full share. The captain might get 2 shares or 1.5, a far smaller multiple than you might expect, because the men would not tolerate a captain growing rich while they stayed poor. The quartermaster, the carpenter, the gunner got a little extra for their skills, but the gap between the top and the bottom was small, deliberately small, a fraction of the chasm between an admiral and a pressed seaman. Every man knew exactly what he was owed the moment the prize was counted, and every man was paid. On a pirate ship, you were not a tool that the owner squeezed for profit. You were a shareholder in the venture. Take the matter of the captain's power, the thing the Navy made absolute. On the pirate ship it was deliberately broken in two. The captain commanded only in the chase and the fight. Everything else, the daily running of the ship, the distribution of food and plunder, the settling of disputes, the punishment of wrongdoers, fell to a second officer the crew elected separately, the quartermaster, who existed precisely to be a check on the captain and a voice for the men. It was a crude separation of powers, invented not by philosophers in a parliament but by illiterate and half-literate seamen on stolen ships, because they had lived under absolute authority, and they were determined never to live under it again. And take the matter that the Navy answered with nothing at all, the matter of the broken body. Here the contrast is so sharp it is almost painful. Many pirate articles contained, written plainly into the text, a schedule of compensation for injury. Lose your right arm in the ship's service and you were owed a set sum, often 600 pieces of 8, paid out of the common fund before any other division of the spoils. Lose a left arm, a leg, an eye, a finger, and there was a price set for each, agreed in advance, owed to you as a right and not a favor. Think about what that actually is. That is workers' compensation. That is disability insurance drawn up by outlaws 300 years ago. On the deck of a ship, the law wanted to hang every man aboard. The most powerful navy in the world told its crippled veterans to go and beg. The pirates wrote them a check. So that is the answer to the question we started with. Why would a man choose to be taken by pirates? Because the pirate ship offered him a vote, a fair share, a captain he could remove, a written guarantee against the day his body failed, and the simple, staggering dignity of being treated as a man with rights rather than a piece of equipment. He was not choosing crime over honesty. In his own eyes, he was choosing fairness over tyranny, and the only reason one was legal and the other was hanged was that the people who wrote the laws sat in the comfortable end of the ship. The pirates had built, almost by accident, in the small lawless gaps at the edge of empire, a working model of nearly everything the wider world would spend the next 2 centuries fighting to obtain. And the world's response, when it noticed, was not to learn from it. It was to erase it, and to make very sure that the men who built it would be remembered only as monsters. Because that, in the end, is how the story closed. The pirate experiment could not be allowed to stand, not because the men were so terribly violent, the Navy was violent too, but because the example was dangerous. A ship full of common men governing themselves, sharing their wealth, choosing their leaders, caring for their wounded, was a far greater threat to the order of things than any amount of stolen sugar. So the empire moved to crush it, and it did so with a thoroughness that tells you how seriously it took the danger. The Royal Navy flooded the trade routes with warships. A new law allowed captured pirates to be tried and executed on the spot, far from any sympathetic court, without the long voyage home that had sometimes given a man a chance. And the crown offered pardons, generous ones, to any pirate who would simply give up the life and come back inside the system, hopping to drain the crews from within. And here is the final, bitter irony, the one to sit with. Many of the men who refused the pardon, who would not go back to the world of the press gang and the lash and the broken body left to beg, were hunted down and hanged. Their bodies were coated in tar to slow the rot and hung in iron cages at the mouths of harbors, at the very entrances to the ports they had once sailed from, so that every sailor coming in or out would see them and learn the lesson. There they swung, the men who had drawn up the first crude charters of fair pay and disability compensation, and the right to depose a tyrant, displayed as a warning by an authority that offered its own loyal sailors none of those things. The criminals had written something close to a Bill of Rights. The lawful order hanged them for it and called itself justice. So the next time you see the cartoon, the cackling villain forcing some poor soul down a plank, remember Thomas Hale at the rail, doing his quiet arithmetic while the officers screamed at him to load his musket. Remember that for him, and for thousands like him, the choice was not between safety and danger or between good and evil. It was between two contracts, one that owned him and one that would have made him a shareholder, one that could flog him to death on a whim and one he could help to right. And remember that the only thing that made one of those contracts lawful and the other a hanging offense was the identity of the people holding the pen. The line between the criminal and the citizen has never been quite as solid as we are taught. It is drawn and redrawn by whoever happens to be writing the rules. And the men in the iron cages at the harbor mouth understood that better than anyone alive. They had simply made the mistake of trying to write their own. If you have made it this far, you are clearly someone who would rather have the real story than the comfortable one, and there is a great deal more of it where this came from. Hit subscribe, because every week I dig past the cartoon and into the strange, human truth underneath the history we think we know. And if you want to know about the pirate articles that went even further than the ones you heard about today, the crews who voted to free enslaved people from the ships they captured and signed them on as equals with a full share, that story is on screen right now.